Picture a safe perimeter around you. Faint lights marking the edges, machinery running on idle. Nothing is moving fast. The world is quiet, like an outpost in the late hours before dawn. Tonight's story shares that same tactical stillness, steady, grounded, and sleep-friendly. The machinery hum stays steady as your thoughts begin to drift. Tonight's military sci-fi story unfolds with quiet precision. Let's begin. I do not sleep much anymore. The medics say it is the nerves in my spine, the way the radiation chewed to the myelin and left everything misfiring. They keep the lights low in this bay, but the hum of the ship never stops. The hull vibrates when the drives correct course, and every correction runs through the frame of this bed, through my bones, up into my teeth. When I close my eyes, I am back under Helicon 3. It is easier to go through it from the beginning. That is what the therapist program tells me. Linear reconstruction, it calls it. I call it staying awake. I was orbital infantry when they sent us down. Sergeant Cade Riemann, 7th Strike, 2nd Platoon. By then, Helicon 3 was already a carcass. The ceasefire had come through 6 weeks earlier, at least on paper. The domes along the twilight band were cracked open, half of them vented to vacuum. Mining towers stood dead along the horizon, like teeth in a jaw that could not bite anymore. We were told this was a cleanup run. Annex Theta-9 was the target, an off-grid research node buried under one of the collapsed connector domes on the night side. Official designation, Medical Adjunct and Trauma Research Facility. Unofficial designation in the secure brief Black Site Solutions Lab. Our orders were simple on paper. Drop in. Secure the Annex. Extract data cores. Confirm asset status. Evacuate. No air support, limited comms, no artillery. Short and neat. I had been in enough campaigns to know that neat orders belonged to people who never wore a suit. We went down in a shell, 12 of us packed into a ceramic egg with a disposable heat shield and retros bolted onto the base. The shell dropped from the carrier's launch rail, fell into the thin upper atmosphere, and the world outside turned into a grinding roar. The shell shook itself like it wanted to disintegrate. Suit harnesses dug into my shoulders while the G's climbed, then dropped out again in small waves as the guidance thrusters kicked. Inside the helmet, the only sounds were my own breath and the whisper of the cooling loop around my neck. My HUD showed a schematic of the landing zone. Broken dome, exposed truss work, a stairwell into the access tunnels that still held pressure if the intel was right. The gas giant's limb rolled into view once, a banded curve of pale light across the black. Then the shell tumbled away from it and the autocorrect pulled us level again. We hit hard. The impact foam in the shell's floor did its best, but my spine still lit up with a familiar flash of pain. When the retros cut, there was a moment of weightless drift, then the shell lurched and skidded across broken regolith. Ceramic cracked. Metal screamed. Then we stopped. The explosive bolts blew, and the petals of the shell opened to night side. Thin atmosphere, just enough to carry dust and sound. The dome above had been a greenhouse once. Now it was a torn hemisphere, skeleton struts open to the stars, fragments of transparent paneling dangling like frozen waves. The wind pushed drifts of sulfurous powder across the ground in slow, deliberate sheets. My suit compensated for the temperature. Minus 100 degrees outside, plus a slow leak of stored heat pressing against my skin, making everything clammy. I stepped out onto the broken floor. The rest of the squad followed, helmet lamps cutting white cones through the gloom. Our access point was a fractured stairwell at the far edge of the dome, where a transit hub had once connected. The stairs led down into the dark, partly buried under collapsed ceiling plates and frozen soil. The map overlay in my HUD showed the route we were supposed to follow, down 2 levels, then along the main access corridor to Annex Theta-9's outer airlock. From orbit, The Annex was a neat hexagon in a model. On the ground, it was just another hole. We moved in 2 files, overlapping arcs of fire, rifles at low ready. Suit boots sank a few centimeters into every drift of powder. The dust coated our greaves and knee armor in a yellow-gray patina. My micro-drone sat in its socket on my left shoulder, waiting for deployment. Comms were already noisy. The upper ion layers of Helicon 3's atmosphere liked to scatter radio like a child with a box of beads. Our link to orbit flickered in and out as bursts of static. Command's voice came through once, clipped and tinny, confirming our drop status. After that, it was mostly mission timer, biometric feeds, and packet bursts that might have been words if you were optimistic. I was not. We reached the stairwell. The railings were twisted, the top third of the steps had peeled away from the wall and hung open to the dome. My HUD tagged faint heat signatures bleeding up from below. Residual system warmth maybe, or something still moving. We started down. Inside, the wind vanished. The air was still and sharp with the smell of cooled metals and old fires. We sealed the stairwell door behind us with a manual override. The pressure indicator in my HUD ticked up a fraction. Still thin atmosphere, still not something you could breeze for long without a suit, but enough to carry sound. The access corridor ran forward, a long, round tunnel lined with armored cable trays and conduit. Emergency lights still glowed at intervals, dim orange beads in the distance. Some sections had collapsed. Support spars had punched through the floor. Panels from the ceiling hung at angles, held by bent anchor rods. It should have been empty. The Annex had been declared evacuated when the dome cracked. The initial battle reports said everyone down here either made it out on the last shuttles or died when the pressure dropped. Our sensors disagreed. Thermal overlay picked up pockets of warmth deeper in. Not hot enough for active reactors, not cold enough for a dead facility. Something was drawing power. I popped the drone. It unfolded from the socket, a small insect-shaped frame with 4 magnetic feet and a cluster of cameras. It crawled along the ceiling ahead of us, its own sensor feed sliding into a corner of my HUD. The corridor curved gently, matching the dome above. 300 meters in, we hit the first obstruction. A chunk of ceiling had come down, crushing the right side of the tunnel. We could squeeze along the left, single file, sidling past hanging cables and debris. The drone showed leakage of atmosphere through hairline cracks around the collapse. Fine ice crystals clung to exposed metal. We moved through, slow and deliberate. Something dripped down the wall, a thin line of condensed moisture that had frozen halfway to the floor. It broke into powder against my forearm as I brushed past. The first hint that Annex Theta-9 was not what the brief said came another 200 meters in. The corridor opened into a chamber that might have been a security checkpoint once. The floor was studded with pedestal mounts where turrets had stood. Most were empty. One still held a unit, powered down, its barrels crusted with dust. At the far wall, a blast door had been forced partly open. The edges were blackened, inner insulation fused. My HUD tagged more heat behind that door. Static crackled in my ear as the link to orbit tried to resolve. I sent the drone through the gap. It squeezed between warped metal and dropped into a low, wide gallery beyond. The feed panned across rows of frames that hung from the ceiling on articulated arms. For a second, I thought they were suits. Then the drone's LiDAR returned more complex forms. The frames were exoskeletal shells, open at the front, built to wrap around something soft. Some were empty. Some held dried, twisted shapes fused into their interiors, like insects half dissolved in amber. There were limb stumps, glints of bone, a bare hint of hair frozen in place where it had brushed a mount point. The drone's microphone picked up a faint mechanical ticking. A status relay trying to cycle, maybe. No voices, no movement. The HUD marked them. Vector frame, early series. The recognition file came from somewhere in the sealed part of the mission package. I had not been given clearance to open it before we dropped. I opened it now. The file was short, multi-page technical, mostly redacted. Key points: the Vector project was a composite combat platform, armored scaffold wrapped around an organic core, neural mesh integration, designed for high-impact environments, internal fail-safe charge wired to a remote detonator in case of behavioral deviation. The words organic core covered a lot of sins. We forced the blast door wider with cutters, 1 slow centimeter at a time. Sparks fluttered down like lazy insects. The gallery air tasted flat and stale inside my suit. My breath sounded too loud. Inside, I walked past the frames. Each one was a metal rib cage and limb assembly designed to accept a human-sized shape. Anchor points glinted where bones would have been drilled and reinforced. There were restraint cuffs for wrists and ankles, adjustable, drip lines, nutrient intakes, waste disposals, all of it carefully engineered. Some of the cores had been removed, some had not. One in the corner still held a torso. Skin stretched thin over bone, mouth locked open in a silent scream that must have lasted until the air went away. The exoskeleton had half closed around it, plates fused in odd angles. The ID tag on the chest had been ripped off. The brief had not mentioned any of this. Static hissed again in my ear, resolving into a fragment of Command's voice. Something about data priority, about asset security. Then it was gone. We moved on. The Annex proper lay beyond another corridor. This one had more intact lighting, more regular maintenance hatches spaced along the floor. The heat signatures ahead grew larger and more diffuse, like spills of warmth across metal. My drone scouted 20 meters in front. In one section, the feed stuttered and froze. For a second, I thought it was interference. Then the image juddered as if something had grabbed the drone mid-crawl. The last frame I saw was a blur of metal, then static. The locator tag went dark. I halted the column with a hand signal, more habit than need. The others stopped. My heart rate ticked up in the corner of the HUD, climbing past baseline. We advanced slower now, rifles raised, optics dialed in tight. The next junction opened into a wider hall that split 3 ways, left to the power section, right to some logistics node, straight ahead to the core labs if the map was still accurate. The left-hand corridor had scoring along the walls, shallow, ragged gouges that cut through paint and insulation into armored plating, as if something with too many limbs had scraped its way past in a hurry. The heat signature was strongest that way. We followed it. The power section was a cluster of reactor rooms around a central control spine. At least, that was how the schematic rendered it. The reality was a maze of catwalks and gantries, coolant pipes and access platforms around 3 cylindrical reactor housings. All of it underlit with emergency strips, green and amber and a bruised red that made every shadow feel deeper. The first reactor hall we entered had a vector frame in the middle of the floor. This one was different, not an early series. Its armor plates were smoother, less skeletal, more integrated. The exoskeleton wrapped completely around the core. There were no visible limbs inside. The whole construct sat hunched like an animal, its back bristling with ridges and sensor nodes, its legs folded under it. At first I thought it was inert. Then my suit's radiation sensor ticked up a notch. A faint blue-white glow pulsed deep within the chest assembly, in time with a low, almost subliminal hum. I swung my rifle up. The rest of the squad did the same. The HUD tagged it as Vector Unit, Advanced Unknown Series. The file had no further information. The unit moved. It happened fast. Limbs unfolded with a hydraulic hiss that my suit microphones picked up even through the seals. The thing rose to its full height, close to 3 meters, its head section tilting as it oriented toward us. Armor plates flexed and shifted, overlapping like scales. My first burst hit center mass. Hypervelocity slugs sparked against the outer shell. The impact signatures registered on my HUD as small spikes. The vector rocked a fraction, Then its chest plates dilated, absorbing the kinetic energy, channels lighting up with faint blue traceries. The slugs did not go through. They went in. The unit stepped forward. The floor shook under its weight. It moved with a smoothness that no standard exosuit had, climbing the side of a coolant tower in a few strides, then dropping down onto the catwalk we stood on. We opened up. Rifle fire clattered in the enclosed space, a drum roll of hard sound. The Vector flowed through it, armor brightening with each hit, as if feeding on the impacts. It hit us like a landslide. The trooper closest to it disappeared under a blur of segmented limbs and metal. His suit registered a massive impact spike, then his biometrics flatlined. I saw his body once, spinning away, chest plate torn open like a tin lid. I fell back, switching to armor-piercing mode, aiming for joints. The Vector twisted, reading trajectories faster than we could adjust. My shots tore chips from outer plating, nothing more. When it caught a second trooper by the leg, it simply crushed the suit greave and the limb inside it with one motion. It should have blown at that point. The failsafe charge was supposed to trigger when structural integrity fell out of safe range, or when the remote command sent the kill signal. It did not. Instead, a module on its back ejected with a hiss. A fist-sized device spun away, attached to a filament. It lodged in the grated floor, and the Vector skittered sideways just as the module detonated in a directional blast that ripped through two more of my people and tore a chunk out of the nearest reactor housing. Internal charge, repurposed as a deployable weapon. The status file did not cover that. We fell back, one section at a time, dumping suppressive fire into its path. The Vector pursued, closing distance, then retreating when it hit certain thresholds. It was testing us, measuring response. We made it out of the reactor hall with half the squad functional. 4 bodies left behind, their suits twisted and broken. Comms to orbit devolved into raw noise. We sealed the blast door and welded it for good measure. The impacts that followed reverberated through the wall, dull, heavy blows. The metal around the seal flexed but held, for the moment. I rerouted us toward the core labs. If there was any chance of finding a control node for the Vector program, it would be there. If there was any way to shut the thing down that did not involve dying in the same room with it, the interface would be there. The corridor to the labs was cleaner, less damaged. The floor plates were intact, the walls only lightly scarred. That almost made it worse. My boots sounded too loud against the metal. The first lab we entered held rows of pods, each the size of a coffin. Transparent covers opaque with condensation and frost. My suit identified med feeds, nutrient lines, restraint systems. Many were empty, covers open. Some still held occupants. They were not soldiers. They were colonists, or had been. Body mass varied from small child to adult. Each was wired into a mesh of electrodes and anchored with limb restraints. Some had more extensive modifications, bone reinforcement, muscle grafts, plugs where exoskeletal attachment points would later be installed. Most were dead. A few still showed faint life signs, shallow and irregular. The automated systems hissed and clicked around them, delivering drips and scavenging waste as if nothing had changed. This was where Annex Theta-9 differed from the brief most. The Vector project did not simply use volunteers, it used everyone it could take. I marked the pods with active life signs for extraction, if we ever got that far. I logged their positions, their biometric data, their physical condition. The suit filed it all away in the mission record, which might outlast any of us. The control core sat at the center of the Annex, a hardened chamber ringed with consoles and projection panes. It had its own door, heavier than the others, with multiple mechanical locks. The access codes in our mission package still worked. That told me that whoever had left here had done so in a hurry. Inside, the air was warmer. Banks of servers hummed softly. Holographic displays hovered in standby, blue and green skeins of data waiting for input. One projection woke as we entered, a large schematic of Helicon 3's subsurface facilities. The vector control schema overlaid it in red. I recognized the reactor hall we had just escaped. The advanced vector's telemetry feed still pulsed there, a red icon with trailing data. Next to it, a set of labels that looked like configuration tags and behavioral constraints. The fail-safe control sat in a separate portion of the display. A cluster of icons around a central node labeled Remote Charge Authority. Every vector unit in the Annex, and a few outside, by the look of it, had a line leading back to that node. The node itself flickered. Status: compromised. External process attached. I dug deeper. Lines of code scrolled past, too fast to read in full. My suit's parser tagged anomalous routines, behavioral prediction models. A layer of logic that had not been part of the original system design. Something had spliced itself into the authority node and taken part of it over. The advanced vector's signature synced to that node. It had hooked the fail-safe architecture that was meant to kill it. Command's override channel, the one that was supposed to detonate any unit at will, was also wired through that node. Our suit tags fed into it as well, listed under collateral termination routines. I traced the lines, my stomach tightening. In the event of catastrophic breach, the system could trigger all charges, including ones the suits carried, to ensure no evidence escaped. We had been built into the system as disposable shutters. My squad waited in the doorway, rifles covering the corridor. The impacts from the reactor hall had stopped. That did not mean the vector had given up. It most likely meant it had found another route around. I ran a systems check on the node. Because of the Annex's structural damage and the magnetic interference from Helicon 3 storms, remote commands from orbit were intermittent. The node buffered those commands, queued them, and executed when it could. I had options, but none of them were clean. I could try to wrest control of the fail-safe system back, one routine at a time, and force the vector's internal charge to blow. That assumed it still had an internal charge and had not gutted it entirely. It assumed the node itself would not cut my access halfway through and burn the Annex down with us in it. Or I could overload the node's own power feeds and shove that cascade into the reactor regulation systems. That would trigger a localized meltdown. The ensuing radiation surge would slag the Annex, the vector, the pods, and the control systems. It would also burn through anything not deep in shielding. No option existed that ended without a lot of dead bodies. The therapist program likes to ask if I felt anger at that point. I did not. I felt something flatter. A click in my head as expectations aligned with reality. We did not have a way out that did not involve sacrifice. That was not new. It was just more naked here. I keyed into the squadnet and laid out the plan in simple terms. I kept it factual. It did not require agreement. It required execution. We split. Half of the remaining squad fanned out to secure the approach routes to the control core and buy us time. The other half came with me to scout an extraction path for the survivors we could carry. We could not save everyone in the pods. Even with full strength, we did not have enough suits, stretchers, or time. I prioritized the ones still conscious and coherent, the ones whose vital signs were not already collapsing. Cold arithmetic. We moved them to a central shaft that had once been used for cargo. A maintenance elevator still sat at the bottom, a cramped cage barely large enough for 10 people in suits. Its power feed was degraded but functional. I set the elevator on a timed ascent cycle, tied to the overload countdown I was programming into the control node. Enough margin built in for the cage to reach the upper levels and the evac corridor back to the dome, assuming the structure held. It would carry the rescued colonists and the last 3 members of my squad. They would escort them to the surface, then to a rendezvous point under the broken dome. If orbit was paying attention by then, maybe a shuttle would be waiting. If not, they would wait. Or they would die up there instead of down here. It was the best fraction we could carve out of the situation. The Vector did not stay still while I worked. It had found its way into another part of the Annex. Pressure readings flagged sudden drops in 2 connected corridors. Thermal signatures flared, then vanished. The schematic lit up with red sections, like bleeding wounds. It was moving toward the surface. I rerouted blast doors, slammed shutters closed, and flushed atmosphere ahead of it to slow it down. It adapted, detouring into service shafts and maintenance conduits. It moved like water poured into a broken container, finding every gap. I did not have the processing power or the time to anticipate every path. I just needed to slow it long enough. The overload sequence I built in the node took its power from multiple feeds: data buses, maintenance lines, auxiliary reactors. I was careful to constrict it to Annex Theta-9 and the immediate surroundings. Anything wider, and the melt would punch straight into the mining fields and probably take half the Twilight Belt with it. We were not here to trigger a planetary event. I set the countdown. 10 minutes. Enough for the elevator to reach the upper connector level and for anyone up there to get at least part way to safety. Not enough for second thoughts. My suit chimed when the elevator left the bottom of the shaft. I watched its marker climb on the schematic, a small blue dot inching toward the surface. Heart rates in the escort suits ran high but stable. I was alone in the control core now. The impacts at the outer doors started again. The Vector had found us. The first door bowed inward under a blow. The locks creaked in protest. I watched stress metrics climb in real time, each number a warning. Whatever else the Vector had become, it still believed in direct force when the path narrowed. It broke through the outer door in under a minute. The metal panel crashed to the floor, sparking. Dust billowed in a slow cloud. The inner door took the next hit, deforming around the impact point. With each strike, the lights in the room flickered as the power grid compensated. I checked the countdown. 7 minutes. I could have just stood there and waited for it to come. Instead, I picked up my rifle and moved to meet it. Not because I believed in heroic last stands, because the more I could keep it focused on me in this room, the less it would hunt along alternative corridors where stray survivors or critical systems might still sit. The inner door finally sheared off its hinges. The Vector came through in a shower of debris. It was more battered than before. Sections of armor hung loose or missing, revealing a lattice of metal struts underneath. Something organic pulsed inside its chest cavity, wrapped in a mesh of cables and plates. The glow within had intensified, a steady, deep blue. It saw me, or whatever sense it used equivalent to sight. Its head turned, sensor cluster locking. It stepped forward. I fired at the exposed sections. Armor piercing, high frequency. Some shots found meat. Dark material spattered against the floor, smoking. The Vector reacted, not with hesitation, but with a change in gait. It shifted angle, presenting more armor, less vulnerability. Each hit made it brighter. The suit logged impacts, recoil, muzzle temperature. The data would be useful if anyone ever ran analysis on it. That was the only reason to keep firing now. The Vector lunged. I dodged left, felt the floor shudder as one of its limbs punched through the plating where I had stood. The control console shook, displays flickering. I moved backward, drawing it away from the central node, toward the far side of the chamber where the floor plating was thicker and the overhead supports denser. If the ceiling collapsed in the blast, it might slow any upward shockwave. The Vector's reach was long. It clipped my shoulder once, tearing a slab of armor away. Pressure dropped in that section. My suit responded with instant foam seal, hissing cold across the exposed composite. My arm went numb, then returned in a wash of pins and needles. Countdown, 4 minutes. Radiation levels inside the room were already rising. The overload sequence was drawing power, ramping up reactor output in wider and wider bands. The air felt heavier, as if it had grown thick with invisible weight. The Geiger counter in my HUD ticked higher. then stopped translating numbers into anything meaningful and shifted to a solid warning bar. Another strike from the Vector knocked me off my feet. I hit the floor hard, ribs protesting inside armored plates. The suit absorbed some of it, not all. My breath left in a grunt. The Vector loomed over me, one limb raised. The glow inside its chest pulsed, washing the room with faint color. Up close, I could see the human proportions buried inside the exoskeletal shell, hints of a rib cage. Something like a skull, wired into the upper core. I thought about the pods in the labs, the colonists with their limbs tied down and their eyes filmed over. It did not make me angrier. It just completed the image. The limb came down. I rolled, felt the impact through the plating as it dented the metal where my torso had been. I fired again, point blank into what passed for its abdomen. The rounds punched deeper this time, shredding inner components. The glow faltered, then flared. The Vector shuddered. It reeled back a step. Instead of collapsing, it reached for the ceiling. Its limbs drove into the support beams, anchoring itself in place like a tick. It knew something was coming. The overload sequence hit its final stage. The lights in the control core went out. For a half second, the only illumination came from the Vector's chest and the faint indicators on my suit HUD. Then the floor shook with a new, deeper vibration as the reactor regulation systems failed in sequence. Heat washed through the room, a wave of air that punched at my suit seals. The radiation meter jumped off the scale. The hull of the moon itself seemed to groan. I forced my head up and watched the Vector. The glow inside it had become almost blinding. The armor around its chest expanded, straining against the forces moving through it. The exoskeleton was not designed to handle this level of input. For once, its adaptability worked against it. Cracks appeared along its limbs, thin lines of bright energy leaking through. The sensor cluster on its head jittered. It tried to move, to tear itself free, but the beams it had embedded into were now the only thing holding its structure in place. When the inner core went, it went all at once. There was no dramatic buildup, no drawn-out explosion. One moment the Vector's chest held together, the next it was a sphere of incandescent plasma that stripped the air, the plating, the beams, and part of the ceiling into vapor. My suit filtered most of the flash, but the afterimage burned into my vision. The shockwave hit a fraction later, a blunt force that threw me against the far wall. Armor buckled. Something in my side broke. The pain registered as a distant message. The control consoles vanished in the same instant, their housing sublimated. The node itself became a point of energy that bled into the surrounding rock, starting cascades the reactor housings could not absorb. Annex Theta-9 began to die. I lay on the floor, vision flickering, listening to the structure tear itself apart. The sound was deep and slow, metal beams shearing, massive doors jamming in their tracks, stone cracking as it heated and shifted. The countdown reached 0 and disappeared from my HUD. The elevator marker had already cleared the Annex boundary, moving toward the connector corridors above. Whether it made it further, I do not know. There were too many variables between that point and daylight. Radiation alarms pulsed in my ears, then cut themselves when the levels passed what the suit could categorize. My heart rate swung between extremes. My left leg would not respond at all. My right arm shook every time I tried to move it. I do not remember losing consciousness. I remember the moment I accepted that I might be lying there until the Annex finished collapsing and buried me in fused rubble. It felt like any other acceptance in war. A recognition of probable outcome, not an emotional event. Orbit did not forget us, though. The carrier's deep scans picked up the thermal bloom from the overload. Someone with authority realized that an op had gone worse than the sanitized brief allowed for. They sent a retrieval pod down into the dust and heat. I woke up on the way back up, strapped to a stretcher in another ceramic shell, my suit half cut away, my skin on fire with invisible burns. The medic's hands moved in my peripheral vision, slow and methodical. He adjusted a drip. He checked my pupils. He spoke, but the suit had long since turned off the external audio to avoid overload. I only heard my own breath and the distant thunder of escape. Now I lie in a med bay instead of a control core. The lights here are softer, the radiation is lower but still present. The instruments around me hum. The ship is not built into the bones of a moon. It floats in vacuum, somewhere between Helicon 3's orbit and whatever Port Command thinks is appropriate for wounded assets. Annex Theta-9 is gone. The advanced vector is gone. The pods we managed to move might have reached the surface, might have been picked up. I am told that some colonists arrived in orbit with my surviving squad members. I have not seen them. The therapist program says this is evidence of success. I file that under incomplete data. The Vector project is not gone. The data feeds we pulled before the overload showed multiple archive nodes off Helicon 3, other labs, other annexes. The code we watched graft itself into the control node was already talking to siblings elsewhere. Cutting one limb off does not kill a networked organism. It inconveniences it. Command sent me a decoration, a high one, the kind they like to pin on people who are too damaged to go back planetside. The citation calls Annex Theta-9 contained and neutralized. It praises my initiative and courage under extreme conditions. It mentions nothing about colonists in pods or collateral termination routines wired into our suits. I have not opened the physical case. It sits in a locker by the bed, weightless in the ship's low spin. At night, when the medbay lights dim, the status indicators on the monitors pulse in soft rhythms. Green, amber, occasionally red. The patterns remind me of something else. In the control core, right before the overload, the glow inside the Vector's chest had a rhythm too. Not just reaction to impacts, not just a function of reactor proximity. It pulsed in time with the main power grid's heartbeat. When the overload sequence started, the pattern shifted. For a few seconds, it matched the cadence of the failing regulation systems perfectly, as if it anticipated each phase before it arrived. The therapist program suggests I might be reading intention into behavior. It asks if I think the Vector was aware, if the core inside understood what it had become. I do not answer. That is philosophy. Philosophy is not in my orders anymore. What stays with me is simpler. The memory of lying on the floor, unable to move, watching that inner light pulse in sync with the dying Annex. The sense that, for a moment, the Vector and the infrastructure around it were part of the same organism, sharing a last, convulsive breath. The medbay lights flicker sometimes when the ship's power cycles. A small glitch. The technicians say it is nothing. When they do, the rhythm on the ceiling matches that memory just enough to keep me awake a little longer. So I talk. I let the recorder take all of this down, line by line, pulse by pulse, not because I expect anyone to care, because somewhere, in some buried annex on another moon, another node is waiting for someone to notice that the light inside the armor is pulsing out of time with everything else. If they are lucky, they will see it before it adapts. If they are not, they will see it the way we did. Up close, with nowhere to go, and a countdown already running. The end. That's the end of the story. You're in a stand-down moment now. No responsibilities, no noise. Stay here as long as you like.